What's up, all? Welcome back to The Question, where you have the questions and I have the answers. And today I'm going to be answering the question, or at least attempting to explain why there isn't really an answer to the question of what is Judaism? So I go to the University of Denver, and I've taken a couple classes for Judaic studies because I'm a Judaic studies minor, because I'm Jewish. And one professor that I had, Dr. Ravner, though he likes to be called Adam, would do a thing, and he's Jewish. Most of the people in the class were Jewish, which is why he would always do this, because this was like one of the few classes that you could get the majority of students to be Jewish. And so it was a fun exercise that he would do for Jewish students, but also a fun exercise for non-Jewish students to see how we interact with this question. And what he would do is he would be at the front of the class and he goes, okay, for everybody who is Jewish, what is Judaism? And we would fight with each other back and forth because we'd answer a question and someone would either bring up how that excludes some accepted group, or he'd bring up a contradiction, and it would just go back and forth and people would get really heated about it. And then he'd propose his theory, and then we get back to class. And he would do this with every class. I've taken 2 classes with him. It's one of his favorite points of the class is to fuck with us in this way. But the thing is, he's right. You can't define it in the way that most people do. And I'm gonna demonstrate, not as fun in the way he did, to you all why this is such a hard question to answer. So Judaism is nominally believed to be an ethno-religion, which basically means, in this sense, that to be Jewish, you can be ethnically Jewish, you can be religiously Jewish. However, you don't necessarily need to be both. You can be one or the other in order to be Jewish. So, for example, I am not a religious person. However, ethnically, I am Jewish. I'm 50% Jewish genetically. That being said, genetics does not necessarily matter. And I was raised in a kind of Jewish manner, with holidays, with the language. Even though I don't have a belief in God, I don't have a belief in a lot of what the Torah commands, outside of just general morals that I stand by. But I don't have a belief in God, and if you go on to Jew Talk, you will see that many people say that you do not need to have a belief in God or believe in the Torah in order to be Jewish. You can be ethnically Jewish. Similarly, a lot of people, and this is something that I think is really interesting, a lot of people will say that Judaism is a closed religion, and a lot of people who argue this are pro-Israel, who say that Judaism and the Jewish people are a indigenous people because you can't join, we don't proselytize. However, that's not entirely true. We, in fact, do proselytize in a way, not in the same way that Christians proselytize, but you can convert to Judaism. Anybody is open to converting to Judaism. It's just a really hard process, and a lot of people don't do it. You can't just start reading the Torah and are like, okay, I'm Jewish now. It's a 1 to 2 to possibly 3 year process that involves, learning the Torah, learning multiple different languages in order to read the Torah in Hebrew, in Yiddish, in whatever local language that you need to, and learning all the rituals and completing all of these ceremonies. It is a long and arduous process. It's not like you just get baptized and it's done. It takes a while, but anybody can convert to Judaism. It is an open religion. It just is gate kept a little bit more. But we're not gonna vibe check you and be like, oh, these people can't be. You just have to put in the work and then you can do it. Or same thing, some families still do this, but back in the day, if you wanted to, to marry a Jewish individual, you would have to convert. And so you get in these places people who are religiously Jewish, and then, but not necessarily ethnically Jewish. However, once you convert to Judaism, it is you now are treated as if you always have been Jewish. So now technically you are then ethnically Jewish. However, genetically you may not be Jewish. But even then, like, you can be religiously Jewish and practice all the religious stuff, but not have the same culture, not have the same food, not do this. And so we see a lot of this. There's an example of like these Jews living in Japan, Japanese Jewish families, and they are religiously Jewish, but they are of Japanese culture, and so they don't eat traditionally Jewish foods, they don't do traditionally Jewish things, but religiously they are still Jewish. And then of course we get into the question of like, well, what is ethnicity? Because like, you're converting, are you considered Jewish? And so your kids will be considered Jewish even though genetically you may not be Jewish. Which is also part of the issue with like DNA tests, is that you can, through kind of a converted parent, then have your entire bloodline, like descendants, be Jewish and be considered Jewish, but then take a DNA test and find out that actually there's no Jewish ethnicity, there's no Jewish heritage genetically from your line, from your history, but it's through conversion. And that is why DNA tests kind of mess everything up, because a lot of it is just, it is through conversion. And that in itself, and just the way that that places itself, inherently complicates the ethnicity in religion, because at that point it no longer becomes ethnicity strictly, but also just culture. It becomes a cultural thing. And that's something that a lot of people leave out when talking about the ethno-religion, is that where that line blurs is just culture. And then the thing about culture is that it's very hard for a culture in a globalized world, in a messy, intermixed world, to stay pure. Which is why then his argument, my professor would get into, was that, okay, Judaism is an ethnicity, how come there are sub-ethnicities within it? Because, as I said, you know, like, there's Jews everywhere, and there's different types of Judaism as they've evolved. And so, like, we break it down, usually there's the three main ones, the Ashkenazi, the Sephardi, the Mizrahi. But then even within those, it's different. And then, of course, there's the Beta Israel, which are Ethiopian Jews. There's Jews from India. And it's different. So, like, within within this Jewish ethnicity, there's sub-ethnicities, and they're all extremely different from each other, to the point where some of them are just unrecognizable to others. And it's not just like different food, different language, different style of dress, different interpretation of laws. They hold different prayers. They have different holidays. We don't all celebrate the same holiday. And so it just becomes messier the more you pick it apart. And then, of course, within different forms, within these different ethnic groups, culture groups, there's different types of Judaism that you practice. That gets complicated. So within the Ashkenazis, which are Eastern European Jews, you have the conservative movement, you have the Orthodox, you have the ultra-Orthodox, you have the Reform, you have secular Jews, like myself, who don't believe in God but are still Jewish, through culture, through ethnicity, through whatever. And then, of course, also you have the Messianic Jews, which people can believe are not actually Jews, but they are people who nominatively are ethnically, genetically, culturally Jewish, who have converted to a different religion. Which then is also interesting, because most Jews, if you go into Jew Talk, this was the big thing with Trisha Paytas, Trisha Paytas, her drama was that, so she married an Israeli Jew, and she, I think, was over the process of converting, or she was considering herself Jewish, but then she got into the whole like Jews for Jesus kind of thing, which many Jews found very offensive, upsetting, but also like, if you're ethnically Jewish, it doesn't matter what religion you are, if that makes sense. And the problem is that many Messianic Jewish communities are made up of Jews who converted either during the Holocaust, converted during another time where it was not safe to practice Judaism, and just stayed in their religion, but they also still are close to their Jewish heritage. Like so growing up, I was one of like 3 Jewish kids in my hometown that I knew of. So it was me, it was this kid named Jonah Mizrahi, who didn't like me, and there was this kid named Kyle Johnson. And Kyle Johnson's family was Jewish. Judaism was very important to them, but their family had converted to Christianity in order to survive the Holocaust. And they were still Christian, and they still are Christian, and their belief in Christianity is super important to them. However, they also recognize and honor their Jewish heritage. And I think, and this is a controversial take, that he's no less Jewish than me, despite the fact that his family converted to Christianity and they're still actively Christian. But also, this is causing problems in Israel for the Beta Israel, which, when I say the Beta Israel, that is Ethiopian Jews. That is what they are called, is what they call themselves. But part of the problem is how Israel defines right of return. So Israel has stated that they have the right of return for people with Jewish backgrounds, and this can include people who are currently Jewish, or people who can trace their Jewish heritage at least back like a few generations. So like, even if you aren't a practicing Jew, if you can be like, oh, my grandfather was Jewish, or you have records of like, my grandfather, my grandmother was Jewish, you can come and you can have the right of return. However, things get tricky about people who were forcibly converted or decided to convert, who still want to have the right of return. So during a period of Ethiopian history, some of the Beta Israel were forcibly converted into Christianity. And those Jews want the right of return as well, even though they want to remain Christian. They want to remain Christian because they're Christian, and that's been important to them because they've been that way for generations, but they also still hold Jewish values and Jewish culture. And the Israeli government, and similarly the Israeli people, don't want to let them in unless they convert out of Christianity back to Judaism, but they won't do that. And so it becomes this really interesting thing of how important is the ethnicity versus the religion, because I've also heard takes in the same class during this discussion that people who convert to Judaism and who are Jewish purely from religion or conversion aren't truly Jewish and will never truly be Jewish because they weren't born into it, and because they don't have a connection to Jewish history, to the Jewish group suffering. But then here we're seeing the conversation of like, oh, well, if you convert to a religion that's different from Judaism, even though you are ethnically Jewish, or you have Jewish heritage, even if you honor that heritage, you're still not Jewish. Which is fascinating to me, because what do we really want this to be? And that's where a lot of my research comes in, because it's full of this conversation of what is Judaism is full of so many contradictions that we as an academic field are not appreciating, and we as a community aren't recognizing as part of the conversation. And I think that needs to be taken into account when we have this conversation. So where was I? Beta Israel, then Yeah, but then like all the different forms, and we're so different. So in the past few weeks, there was Sijid, which is a Beta Israel holiday not celebrated by any other Jews. And similarly, they practice Judaism in a way that we can't understand, that we can't recognize, and that's why it took them so long to get the right of return, because they just weren't identifiable as Jews to the Israeli government, who is now the authority on who gets to be Jewish and who doesn't, because that's how that works. Which also then begs the question, because part of the pro-Israel movement, and especially those from inside Israel, is that Jews need to be thinking of themselves as Middle Eastern, as indigenous, in order to progress the pro-Israel movement. And it's a detriment to the cause when, especially diaspora Jews, especially like Jews in America, view themselves as white. And this led me to a whole thing of like, because the argument that was made was that whiteness is a construction specifically around Anglo-Saxon, like Christian, nominatively Protestant Christian values. And so that is why Jews consider themselves white passing instead of white, because while they have white skin like I do, they don't fit into the Anglo-Saxon Protestant type, because their culture, their religion is automatically outside of that white norm, that white hierarchy, because they aren't Christian. Their food ways are different, and that has been a problem. Their holidays are different, their religious systems are different, and that has created problems within the US, because the US just is not built to accommodate them, despite the fact that legally it's accommodating. And so for that reason, we should not consider ourselves white, but rather white passing, because on a colorism basis, many of us pass as white and hold that white privilege. However, when it gets down to the nitty-gritty of cultural value, we're still oppressed. And so I got into a conversation with my friend Tim, because I think it's interesting, and I think this goes back to other conversations of the fact that racial caste systems are different in different countries, and that affects how, and that makes everything that we identify as political, you know? And my issue always with the, well, I'm white passing, especially from Jews that look like me, saying that, well, I'm not white, I'm white passing, is that I think to a degree it ignores and is used to ignore the privilege that we do have within a system that primarily is built on colorism. Like, obviously, when you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, it is that Protestant Anglo-Saxon hierarchy that exists, but it is primarily built around colorism, and that is the main thing that affects here in the US, especially when it comes to the slave trade, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to just the racialization of it all, and how colorism becomes such a potent enforcer of who belongs and who doesn't, and how that has been used then to affect other communities as well, not just Jews, but also like the paper bag test for Black individuals. We just don't look indigenous, you know, I'm part of the blood quantum. Or the fact that Latina as a category is defined by language, not by race. And so even though you can have Latin American individuals who are clearly not white the way that I look white, but still be counted as white as a census, because their category doesn't exist. Same thing with Middle Eastern people, doesn't exist. The way that you can be cut in and out of the system is wild. And that also gets me to my next point, that because of all this complicated bullshit, it is nearly impossible to get an accurate census of how many Jews live anywhere, because it is such a complicated identity to interact with. Like, something that I have started doing, that the rabbi at DU told us at our Passover Seder a few years ago, is that when it comes to ethnicity or race, he puts himself as white, and then he marks down Ashkenazi Jewish, because ethnically, racially, he is white. Racially, he is white. Ethnically, he's not Caucasian. Ethnically, he's Ashkenazi Jewish, because that's different. It is a separate ethnicity. And I think that's a problem, especially since the majority of Jews in America are secular. If you only have Judaism as a religion, a religious option, you don't know how many people are just going to put that they're Jewish just to have it counted that they're Jewish, or if they're not going to mark it because religiously they're not Jewish. Like, ethnically, culturally, that's their religion. Religiously, it's not. Because I know that until I heard about you can just write in Ashkenazi Jewish, that I would just put that my religion was Judaism, because I needed some way of the census knowing that I'm Jewish. But not everybody's going to do that. Not everybody's also going to write in what they put. And so we can't know how many people are actually Jewish at any given moment in the US or anywhere, because we haven't found a way to fully encapsulate everything that Judaism entails, because we don't know what it is. And that's why I am more of the belief, one, that it's a culture, and with its own religious system, like ethnic system, but also, along with Dr. Ravner, that it is its own nationality. So here's my argument for it to be a nationality, based off of everything that I have previously said, is that, one, there is, a united Jewish origin. There is a united Jewish people, maybe not very united, but it is solidly in itself a lineage. It is a culture. It is an identity with sub-identities in it. Like, the United States is a nation, and so many people are American, and then there's different kinds of American that you can be. Similarly, like as a national identity, it works because it is a way of encapsulating all the differences that we have while being under one label. We have a religion, but it's not necessary. People can be Jewish without the religion. It's not mandated. And people can be religious without being of the ethnicity, of the genealogy. People can enter or leave the nation as they choose. And there is a history, a complicated history. And we have our own problem. We have our own hierarchies. We have our own forms of education. We have our own languages. We have our own laws, kind of. We have all of this. And I put this as Judaism as a nation, separate from Israel as a nation, because, as my dad has pointed out, Israel is trying to be two things at once. It is trying to be a nation state for Jews, but it's also trying to become a democratic nation, which means in and of itself a globalized world, and it's trying to prioritize the rights and lives of the Jewish people because it is a Jewish nation. However, as my dad has pointed out, it doesn't follow Jewish law, it doesn't enforce Jewish law. And that's also the issue with right of return, is that it is making decisions about who's Jewish and who's not based off of the Torah's definition of Jewishness, not based off of the Talmud's definition of Jewishness, but something different. And that being said, I think that we need to expand our definition of Judaism and Jewishness and who can be Jewish based off of everything else I've said in the previous parts of this video. But it doesn't, he was like, it doesn't enforce kashrut, it doesn't enforce the Sabbath, it doesn't enforce these things. It's not based off of Jewish law. The only thing that is based off of Jewish law is that if you want to get married, if you want to do certain things, you have to go through like the synagogue, you have to go through the Orthodox synagogue, but most people don't, because most people aren't religious. And that's the issue, is that, and that's the reason why my dad will say that Israel is not a Jewish state, because it's not made with Jewish values. It's not made off of this. It is made from an idea of how can we compete in a westernized way. And that's the problem also, is that we don't know how to define what Israel is, because it is a state in the Middle East. However, so much of what it is and how it was designed and how it was created and how it is run is from a very westernized standpoint, and it is prioritized in the West so much more. It is viewed as just another Western state, despite the fact of its placement in the Middle East. And that is also how we get into this conversation of, well, are Jews indigenous to the Middle East or not? And it's hard because, as you know, 50% of Israel's population is Mizrahi, meaning that they're Jewish, but their backgrounds are in the Middle East. And the Mizrahi identity is complicated as well, and that can be a whole other video. But they're Middle Eastern. However, the people who are nominatively in power of Israel, the people who created Israel, the people who formulated its laws, are Ashkenazi from Eastern Europe. And this is why many Mizrahi Jews, as well as just other pro-Israel Jews, ask that Ashkenazi Jews, ask that diaspora Jews decolonize their idea of Judaism, because we look at it from a very westernized standpoint. And I think I've talked about this before, that like just the way that Europe has interacted with religion and culture, and the way that the Middle East has interacted with religion and culture is very different. And that's why we have this clashing of how we are viewing our religious identity and our like cultural identity in the wake of these things. But like Ashkenazi Jews, I think nominatively do have a very westernized look and view of it, and because we were the ones that created Israel, that's how it was made. And so we brought all of the problems that we experienced in Eastern Europe, in America, that we have become like indoctrinated into, we brought that with us. And that's the problem, is that we brought this hierarchy, we brought this white supremacist norm with us. Even though we aren't white, we brought these ideals with us because that's what we were exposed to, that's what we were ingrained into. And so I think oftentimes when we view ourselves as outside of that system and we view that system oppressive to us, we haven't necessarily unlearned those processes. And so we see a lot of that reflected in how this nation was run, this nation was created. And so I think decolonizing the Jewish identity doesn't necessarily mean disavowing whiteness or disavowing the areas that we exist in the Western world, but I think it means in a similar way to when Palestinian activists say we need to decolonize our minds in the US, we're decolonizing the same thing. It's white supremacy, it's capitalism, it's racism, it's colorism, it's all the things. Because even though we aren't in the system the way that we think we are, we also aren't ostracized by the system that we think we are. And we do need to decolonize that, both in the diaspora, but also within Israel, because you're telling me that the diaspora has more of a colonized mindset problem than Netanyahu himself, than Gallant himself. It's not, it's the same problem, because it's the same people. Netanyahu is Ashkenazi. Gallant is Ashkenazi. You know, they both have Western education. They both have Western upbringings, despite the fact that they're from Israel. And I think that also then becomes a conversation that we're slowly getting to with, as these movements become more complicated and more intertwined with each other, is that just because you are of a marginalized background or of a marginalized identity does not mean that you are absolved from enforcing the system that we are in. And I think that's something that Jews, especially in the United States, get caught up in, is that the majority of us are white passing. We have white skin. And if we aren't obviously Jewish, I will say, like, we don't have the Star of David on us, we're not wearing a kippah, we don't have, you know, like the side locks and the beard. If we aren't presenting in a overtly Jewish way, we are white. And we are benefiting from this system, even if culturally we are different from the system. We're still benefiting from it in a way. And we still have spent so many generations here trying to fit in, trying to assimilate, and we have assimilated pretty well, even to the point where the mindset of needing to assimilate has been ingrained in us. And it's not just Jews. You know, this exists everywhere. It's why we have Black Republicans. It's why we have Black people who don't care about the colonization of places abroad. And it's all this to say that Jews and Palestinians are in the same fight of trying to decolonize this area, because it's not just Jews are the colonizers. It's the fact that these specific Jews who brought over and enforced this system, this European system of dominance, those are the colonizers. Netanyahu is the colonizers. And it's ultimately an educational, we need to decolonize our mindset in order to bring peace to these regions and bring peace to ourselves and our own systems. Because this idea of dominance, the even conversation that we're having of who belongs here more, is in itself from a colonized mindset. It's not about who gets the right. It's how can we all live together? How can we all eradicate this system? And that's the conversation that's not being had. Because one of the things that is inherent to me about Judaism, the core value, is tikkun olam, which is repair of the world. And I think that if that is not at the basis of everything that we do as Jews, as people, then it's not Jewish. And I know that Israel and people who support Israel believe that we are tikkun olaming because of the wars that we wage. But that's exactly what America says. You know, when we went and we overthrew governments and we did all the things that we did in the Cold War, of like, oh, we're making the world better by overthrowing people's autonomy. We're making the world better because of this. And we aren't making the world better. The only people that we're making the world better for is ourselves. And that's not what repair of the world is. The repair of the world is for the world. It's for everybody. And it's not. because we're not valuing the autonomy of other people. We're not valuing the perspective of other people. And that's what we're seeing here, is we're seeing this now like continuation. If anything, it's like generational trauma, you know? That's what we're seeing. We're seeing the manifestation of generational trauma of a oppressed people now turning that oppression on something else because it's all that they know. Because it's all that they know. And I know that we talk about this a lot and it's been said a lot, but that literally is what it is that we knew enough that we were being oppressed, and now we're not oppressed, but we never fully understood all the systems that were oppressing us and how it was intertwined with others. And that's how you get the idea of like, oh, we're the most oppressed people. Only our uplifting of oppression matters because we were the most oppressed. Not thinking about how that's intertwined with everything, but it should be, because we are intertwined with everybody. Like, look at everywhere in the world that Jews are, all of the cultures that we have come to call home, all the languages that we speak, all the food that we eat, all of the ways of living that we have discovered, that we have formed, that we have been in. We are everywhere. And so to try and like create an exclusionary definition that erases the experiences, that cuts us off from everything else, I think is a huge mistake and a huge discredit to everything that we have done and everything that we are. And granted, like, we've come to where we are in the world through oppressive means, through expulsion. But I think that too often we let that define us, and we don't look at all of the beauty of diversity that we have. And instead we try and, like, I know I've seen so many sites being like, oh, you can't define us by who hates us, we can't define it by this. Like, but we do that to ourselves. We define ourselves by our own depression. And in trying to make up for that, we are excluding all the things that has come from this. You know, like, there's so many niche communities that are being erased because we don't talk about them, because it doesn't fit the narrative of oppression. And so much of it is like these narratives that we tell ourselves that, oh, we are the most oppressed people, that we've survived all these things. And yes, we have survived, and we've thrived in many places. You know, like, and the way that we talk about ourselves and the way that we view ourselves and the way that the world views us doesn't account for that. Like, there are Jews in Cuba, there are Jews in Japan, like I said, there's Jews in India that retain their Iraqi, specifically Baghdadi identities, while also viewing themselves as wholly Indian. There are Jews in Puerto Rico, there's Jews everywhere. There's Jews still living in Afghanistan. Like, we survive and we discover new ways to be Jewish. We discover new ways to interact with the world. And I do truly believe that the state of Israel is antithetical. The modern state of Israel is antithetical to that, because it aims to erase and homogenize all that we are. And while I think we should totally have a state, I think it should be a democratic state. And that's not what Israel is. It's not a democracy outside of legality alone. It's not democratic in representation. It's not democratic in even how it represents the Jewish people. We aren't democratic within ourselves because we aren't acknowledging and we aren't embracing all of our diversity. And that is what makes me really sad, is I know that we want it and we can have it, but we just need to get there. But we're so distracted by all of these colonized problems in our minds that we can't see it. We can't see each other. We can't see ourselves for what we are, because we are so beautiful. And I really, really wish that everybody else could see it too. I love being Jewish. I love my community so much. And that's why I will continue to fight us, because I'm so hoping that through these controversies I create in my college and through these things that I post, that other Jews can see this and see the beauty in us too. I see so many posts of like pro-Israel Jews saying that we need to fight back and we need to be proud Jews, and as if Jews who are fighting for a free Palestine are any less proud of being Jewish than anyone else. I am the most proud Jew that you could probably have, and I am not going to be on the streets waving an Israeli flag. I will be out here showing you all the recipes that are going to be lost, talking about all of the different histories of the Mizrahi Jews. I'm going to be talking about how I was raised. I'm going to be talking about how, like, all the different incredible people that I've met and all the different ways that you can be Jewish, because it is the world to me. And that's why it hurts that I have this view, and then I go out into this community that I love so much, and they are incapable of loving me back. Yeah. So what is Judaism? I think it is life itself.